Hey, this is Mohal Joshi from Los Angeles, California. I follow Indian foreign policy and defense with a special focus on Asia. You can follow me on Twitter at Mohal Joshi.
Hey, this is Kishor from Bengaluru in India. I am an international relations expert specializing in global security, conflict resolution, and international negotiation. My focus areas include peace building and digital diplomacy. You can find me on Twitter at Veggie Diplomat. Did Narendra Modi and Xi Jinping manage to revive the now dead, now alive Wuhan Spirit? Has New Delhi managed to drive home the point about its red lines to Beijing? Does India and China have enough modalities to work on improving their ties in the next 12 months? Is it too early to claim that Chennai Connect was a huge success without talking about tangible benefits? Hello and welcome to episode 22 of India Rising Strategic Affairs Conversations with Mohal and Kishor, a show in which we analyze the happenings from around the world and their impact on India. This week, Chinese President Xi Jinping visited the South Indian city of Chennai for an informal summit with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. This was the second edition of the informal summits that China and India are having, with the first one happening in 2018 April in China in the city of Wuhan, hence gaining the name Wuhan Spirit. Mohal, can you set the context for what happened at Wuhan?
Yes, Kishore. So the Wuhan summit in April 2018 came post a buildup of tensions between India and China over the few preceding years, and which finally culminated in the standoff in the Dolam Plateau at the India, Bhutan, and Tibet tri-junction. Now, what however has happened that both the government's most ardent supporters and its most vocal critics have tended to read too much into that summit. Now, both sides, uh, India and China, had acknowledged that in the previous few years, the relations had become highly strained, and they needed to sit down to talk each other. The modus vivendi of the past few decades between India and China had broken down, and the new CBMs, or what is referred to as confidence building measures, needed to be undertaken. So, in my opinion, this was more of a reset than anything else. However, like as you know, many critics have spoken of either the Wuhan being a massive a massive failure due to events past the Wuhan summit, or the supporters have touted it to be a huge success.
Thank you, Mohal. So that's the exact thing that we'll look at right now. So the question since 1 year and upwards of Wuhan was that had the spirit of Wuhan actually faded away, which is exactly what you were pointing out to, Mohal. It is important to note that although Wuhan was held as an ice-breaking meeting, there was no joint statement issued at all. Both China and India had issued separate statements. The Indian press release at the end of the Wuhan dialogue had mooted it as a positive factor for stability amidst current global uncertainties. It was driven by the need to promote strategic communications, high level interactions with the view of removing mistrust and reduce the danger of miscalculation in the wake of the Dolam incident. Before the meeting and after it, we saw a surge in the frequency of high level ministerial and official visits between India and China and the meetings between ministers and leaders of the two countries. Now, in terms of the important achievements from Wuhan, was the strategic guidance to the two forces to maintain peace and tranquility on the border. Luckily, we all know that this has been a largely peaceful boundary or line or whatever you want to call in the past four to five decades, and it has continued to do so. Now, this has broadly ensured that peace remains, and also give a fillip to the military exchanges between the two sides. Though India and China were not able to do any joint project in Afghanistan, which was agreed upon in Wuhan, they did manage a joint training program for Afghan diplomats. And in May of this year, China did come forward to lift its hold on the designation of Masood Azhar as a terrorist under the United Nations 1267 committee. Again, Mohal, we have covered this event quite in detail in one of our earlier podcasts. So, in the past 1 year, again, the two sides have held their sixth strategic economic dialogue and the ninth finance dialogue. And they have continued to cooperate in multilateral mechanisms like the Russia, India, China trilateral, BRICS, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the G20. Yet, the climate of relations in which the Mamallapuram meeting took place was more complex and difficult than at the time of Wuhan. And we will see why. What was obvious to see prior to the Mamallapuram informal summit was the manner in which India showed resilience. It is well known that the establishment in New Delhi was emboldened by the stupendous victory in the 2019 May elections. Even when China was issuing adverse statements and making antagonistic remarks after the Indian government revoked the special status of the state of Jammu and Kashmir, India did manage to push back China by saying that this was an internal issue of the country and it would accept no intervention from any third party. So, politically, from a domestic angle, the Narendra Modi government came back for a second term with a renewed majority, and Xi Jinping is now more or less the president for life in China. So it is quite obvious that the two leaderships will have to deal with each other. There is no way that they can wish away the other person. So they will have to find ways to continue talking and to take the ties forward.
And
Now,
also on
mhm,
the, just wanted to mention that the initial response of China on the changing of the status on Article 370 was quite muted.
right,
But I think after I think Amit Shah mentioned the words Aksai Chin, it probably raised more red flags in Beijing, and that's when the more vigorous pushback from China started. After which the External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar clarified that we are not making any uh, additional bound territory
claims to the
claims
border. Yeah.
over the existing ones.
You are right. Yes, thank you. So, yeah, what was obvious to see prior to no. During the lead up to the Mamallapuram summit, a visit by Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi to New Delhi, which was to be held in the second week of September, was cancelled at the last minute. This visit by the foreign minister was meant to not only discuss the modalities of the Mamallapuram visit, but was also supposed to have been another round of the special representative talks. Mohal, you want to elaborate what these special representative talks are?
Yeah, so the special representatives have been, I think the process has been ongoing for, I forget like when exactly, like the 80s or the 90s, correct? Or the 2000s?
It was after the Vajpayee's visit.
Yeah, so 2003. Sorry. So the special representatives have been talking on the border issues where they hold a series of, I think they hold like 21 rounds of meeting
Right.
to delineate the border so that the boundary dispute, which has been long running since the 50s, can be amicably be resolved. But as you know, there's been no overall resolution because one, China has not been very forthcoming even with its claims. It just likes to keep the issue running because it sees no advantage in resolving the dispute with India.
Absolutely, yeah. So the Chinese foreign minister, who is also the special representative, was expected to travel to Delhi and meet the National Security Advisor Ajit Doval. Wang, who would have traveled after having completed a visit to Pakistan. Officially, as per the Chinese Foreign Ministry, the meeting was pushed back due to scheduling constraints from the Indian side. However, reports in the Indian press suggest that the fact that he was due to travel from Pakistan was viewed in an unfavorable light, as it would imply hyphenating India with Pakistan. This is something that India has been very, very cautious about. They don't want any world leader or any minister from any third party government to come from Pakistan to India. The same thing happened when
MBS visited
absolutely,
Pakistan. Crown
absolutely.
Prince.
Yeah, what he did was to go back for just one day to
Yeah.
Riyadh
To.
and then come back
Mhm,
all the way
mhm,
again to Delhi. Yeah,
mhm.
so once Islamabad visit on September 7th and 8th mentioned the Kashmir issue. It said that China opposes unilateral actions, but it also sees this as a dispute left from history and should be properly and peacefully resolved based on the United Nations Charter, relevant Security Council resolutions, and bilateral agreements. India's foreign ministry, on its part, was prompt to criticize this reference to Kashmir, specifically mentioning the CPEC projects and also raising concerns about changes in the status quo in Pakistan occupied Kashmir. At the same time, reports tell us of the first serious post Wuhan border incident between India and Chinese troops in Ladakh that week. The standoff was reportedly resolved after delegation level talks.
But I think the good part I read was somewhere that the standoff was resolved in just over a day.
Hmm.
Now this some people have been giving. I mean, long term we'll know what's the true story. That the new mechanism that was agreed to in Wuhan, where they wanted a strategic communication between the armed forces of the both the nations. Uh, Maybe that would have held an helping hand in resolving the issue sooner rather than later, because as we've seen with incursions in 2014 and even later, some of these standoffs seem to have lingered for weeks before any resolution, whether before the Chinese side withdrew to the Tibetan side of the LAC. Okay, so while all this is happened in early September, the second half of September saw all the action shifting to New York on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly annual meeting. The External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar recent comment at a program organized by the New York-based Council on Foreign Relations, where he said that considering that international affairs is a business of realism, that there are differences with China. It's not a secret. They accept it. We accept it. We have a boundary issue. We have other areas where we may not always agree. But I think today it is a very stable relationship. It's a very mature relationship. Where we differ, we have mechanisms and a sort of in a way, a sort of ethos of handling it. And frankly, it's a relationship that has given cause for anxiety for the world for many many years, end quote.
Hmm. So I think that's a very prudent and mature statement coming from the minister,
Hmm.
Jaishankar.
I think one point, if I may add, Kishore, if you allow me,
Hmm.
I think while we had like blowhard, blow cold relations with the Pakistanis, and we had armed conflict with uh, lots of casualties on there. I think one thing we need to remember that since the 1967, the Nathula incident, I don't think a single shot has been fired in anger across the LAC, even though it remains highly disputed, and we have lots of Chinese incursions over the past 50 plus years. So that's one thing to remember, that it's quite a stable relationship per se, even though the Chinese keep needling us at the border from time to time whenever they please.
And I was just reading an article where it clearly said that while the Chinese do their incursions,
Mm-hmm.
it's also true that our soldiers have equal number of incursions onto the Chinese side. And it's
Mm-hmm.
just that while our media picks it up
Mm-hmm.
mentions it and makes a big deal
Yeah.
about it, the Chinese media does not do the same.
Yeah. I
So
think that's a sorry. Go ahead. Complete your thought.
yeah. So that kind of not only, I mean, it's both good and bad in the sense that
Mm-hmm.
good that we actually uh, get an idea of what exactly is happening, if not from the
Mm-hmm.
Chinese side, at least from the Indian perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But bad because any small incursion is also blown out of proportion most of the time, and
True. True.
that actually spoils the atmosphere, spoils the
Mm-hmm.
environment, and it kind of puts a lot of pressure on the top leadership to
Mm-hmm.
address these, in my opinion, small issues rather than actually
Mm-hmm.
tackle the larger issues. Mohal?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. See, like, I mean, we have a dispute for over Jammu and Kashmir where Pakistan occupies a large chunk of Jammu and Kashmir, but at least there is a delineated line of control up to like 0.9842, beyond which it's not delineated. But at least from the Punjab border
Hmm.
to 0.9842, we have a deleted LOC which has been agreed upon by India and Pakistan, I think, based on the 1949 Karachi Agreement, Kishore, right?
Yeah, based on the ceasefire from the
Yeah.
1948
So
war.
we have a while, but see, compared now that to the LAC, we don't even have a defined border. Like, forget the territorial claims. We don't even have a line of actual control. The
Right.
perceptions of it might vary. So while I might think that, okay, I might patrol in this area, uh, if the border is not even defined, how does the other side has a differing perception of whether he is patrolling within his own area or within area that I claim to be my own. So I think that's a large difference that gets overlooked many times, that the LAC not being a defined border versus LOC being a defined border, even though the territories beyond the border would be not would be claimed by us.
And
Kishore?
that is why the mandate for the special representatives talks is actually threefold: define, delineate, and demarcate. And they've been going on for 21 plus rounds.
Hmm.
Let's see
Yeah,
how
but
long it
mhm.
will progress.
But I think the frustrating part is, while we have put forth our claims,
Hmm.
the Chinese, for some apparent reason, have never put forth their claims. So I guess when I, let's say, if we both are negotiating something, I might put my claims and you put your claims, and then you have to negotiate somewhere in between, or one side completely gives up. But if the other side doesn't even make a claim, then how do you? There's nothing to negotiate with. So
Right.
that's the frustrating. Even though the Chinese keep uh, saying that there could be, I think what they call is an early harvest, maybe recognizing or delineating the border in certain parts, maybe the central Uttarakhand
Hmm.
sector, and Himachal. But I guess only time will tell if this early harvest that they so fondly talk about will come to fruition or not.
Right, right. Okay, let's move on. So now both the countries approached the Mamallapuram summit with their own wish lists. While for India, it was the trade deficit, the border dispute redressal mechanisms, and the global fight against terror. For China, it was to convince India to wholeheartedly embrace the regional comprehensive economic partnership, or in other words, the RCEP, which is actually a multilateral free trade agreement among the countries in and around the larger Trans-Pacific region. Now, both sides have been sparring over the terms of the 16-nation RCEP agreement. After years of negotiations, there are now serious questions about whether India wants to be a part of the pact or not at all. While Indian industry and government have a number of concerns with regard to RCEP that need addressing, chief among them is the nature of trade with China and the prospects of Chinese goods flooding the Indian market. So, in other words, these 16 nations comprise the ASEAN nations: Japan, Korea, China, of
Australia,
course,
New Zealand.
Australia, New Zealand, China, of course, and then India. I may have left out one or two here, but these are the primary countries. So now the idea is that if you end up having a free trade agreement with all these countries, Now, China has already managed to flood India with their products. And with
Mm-hmm.
an FTA, the floodgates might open even more.
Mm-hmm.
And there would be no way that the Indian local manufacturers would be able to compete with the
Mm-hmm.
Chinese products. So I think
Mm-hmm.
that's a major concern for which India still does not have any answer from any
Mm-hmm.
of the RCEP negotiating parties. And that's one concern for which India still has not wholeheartedly agreed to join the pact.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the problem for the others is just because India is reluctant and India is not willing to jump into the deep end of the pool, so to speak, it is kind of holding back the rest of the countries from even agreeing on the deal and getting started. So
Mm-hmm.
all the other countries are also uh, kind of getting irritated with the Indian behavior, and they are kind of looking at a last ditch effort to uh, keep India on board. And if India does agree, it would be good for the entire region economically. If not, then these nations will have to go solo without India on board.
Yeah, I think you brought up a excellent point, and let me latch on to the one of the last points you made. So you said like they still are holding out hope that India will join. I think they see India as a large target market, and I think
Absolutely.
that's where the concerns of the import and exports will come in. That India might not be able to, unfortunately, because we don't have a large manufacturing base and to export whole lot. So we could be ending up importing not only from China but also from the ASEAN nations,
Hmm.
which are strong in manufacturing, and
Yeah,
also Japan, South Korea.
yeah, we already have an FTA with the ASEAN nations. So there may not
Hmm.
be any major changes with
Hmm.
regards to the import from them.
But Japan, South Korea,
Oh,
Australia, New
absolutely.
Zealand would be another.
Absolutely.
Like for example, there was a concern I read in an article about like dairy products being flooding into the Indian market would affecting like the rural farmers who are into dairy business, so that, and I think that is a concern. I think one of the articles I just read today, it said that India did outline its concerns on RCEP, and Xi understands that we do have concerns. I'm not sure the
Mhm.
veracity of the report, but it'd be interesting to see if even if they express understand our concerns, what would be they willing to do about it.
Yeah, yeah, right, right. Okay, so moving on a more realistic level, Mohan, can you elaborate what India and China can really cooperate on?
Yeah, I think there are we have several divergences with China. I mean, some of which Kishore touched upon earlier in the podcast. But I think there are some uh, facets in the global polity where I think India and China are looking to cooperate more. So there are like multilateral organizations like the BRICS, the AIIB, the New Development Bank, the IMF, and also like global issues like climate change. Now, India and China have a similar complaints about their representation in the World Bank and IMF. I mean, during the Wuhan summit, it was decided that India and China will jointly train Afghani diplomats.
Right.
So, and now India and China are now planning to cooperate in training law enforcement officers and cooperate in protection of archaeological sites in Afghanistan. Um, and China also is like announced that it's in favor of expanding the mechanism of this India China cooperation in a third country. I mean, the details are not out like on which would be the other third country where they would be uh, looking to cooperate. Now, China in like some official statements did mention, like, and I quote, that we hope that China India plus cooperation is not only restricted to Afghanistan. We will further deepen our cooperation in Afghanistan. This time, President Xi will visit Nepal. We hope that the China India plus cooperation will be expanded to Nepal, and we also hope that cooperation will be expanded to Bhutan and quote.
That's actually a tricky situation for India, Mohal, if you will agree with me. Simply because when India and uh, China enter into some kind of a joint partnership to develop in third countries. India is known for being notoriously slow,
Mm-hmm.
whereas China is known to be super quick in completing projects before the deadline. So, any attempt to enter joint partnership might imply that the Indian portion of the project is progressing at a snail's pace and might not help India's image it, in the third country and also worldwide. One popular example is
Mm-hmm.
how India took 5 to 6 years to build a police training academy in Kathmandu, and
Mm-hmm.
then eventually Nepal had to stop that agreement with India, and then the
Mm-hmm.
Chinese came and they built that police training academy within 14 15 months, and that kind of was a hard slap on the face for India, and
Mm-hmm.
it kind of held mirror to India's slow pace at working on any major projects.
Yeah, I think I agree there. I would see more like a cooperation in like the training of the Afghani diplomat realm. I
Hmm.
wouldn't see any infrastructure building because
Correct.
one, it would be like who would give the loans. I mean, Chinese are notoriously at the debt trap
Hmm.
loans. Also, many of the projects Chinese like to involve their SOEs, their state-owned enterprises, and like to bring over workers from China. So there would be just too many problem. So I think it would be anything minus infrastructure
Hmm.
in terms of cooperation between India and China, maybe like training diplomats or more in the soft space rather than the hard infrastructure building space, I would say.
Correct. Or even institution building for that matter.
Yeah, true. That's
Right.
correct.
Okay. So, Mohal, what did you think before the summit? What were the key expectations from them?
I mean, I think the expectations were pretty much low key
Hmm.
this time compared to Wuhan, because probably this has been the second round of this informal summit. I mean, there is no grand bargain in the offing, as the scope for give and take in Mamalapuram is very low. I mean, officials on both sides did work hard to project any kind of substantial outcome. I mean, there was some speculation about some more confidence building measures to be announced post summit. But Kishore, did you hear anything substantial from here? Any major confidence building measures? I didn't, because I didn't.
No, nothing major in terms of CBM. I think the only one was agreeing in principle to have some kind of a delegation level talk to address the trade deficit. But
Yeah,
beyond
yeah.
that, there was nothing major about any CBMs.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Go on,
So,
Mohal.
yeah. So another major irritant just before the summit was that for China was that India was committing a joint exercise called Operation Him Vijay.
Hmm.
So China had expressed concern about this Him Vijay exercise, which was underway in Arunachal Pradesh as just as President Xi was visiting. Now, the Chinese reaction is hardly surprising given the strategic significance of this exercise, which marks the operationalization of various elements of Indian armed forces. So, for a very long time, like India hadn't not developed any infrastructure in our areas on our side of the border adjoining to Tibet. The reasoning was that any lack of infrastructure would slow down any Chinese advances into Indian territory during times of either localized incidents or war. Now, however, in the meanwhile, the China continued to a massive upgradation of their infrastructure in the Tibetan plateau. So what happened is like around a decade ago, like finally, um, India woke up and like got working on the strategy that this is not a feasible strategy of just deterring China
Hmm.
from invading India because the infrastructure beyond the LAC is poor. So they started improving the infrastructure on our side of the border. Now the question remains that in an event of a land grab by the Chinese in any sector across the LAC, what would India's options be? India's armed forces will certainly put up all effort to repel the invaders at all costs. However, another option is to put the pressure back on China, is for India to open up a front somewhere else along the LAC to make an incursion into Tibet. I think this was seen in 1965, where after the Pakistanis in
Hmm.
the during the
Right,
65 war.
right.
In the Cham sector they of Jammu Kashmir and in around Punjab, they invaded into Indian territory. So we made a opposite thrust in the other direction where we had reached the outskirts of
Uh,
Lahore.
Lahore, yes.
So basically, to in the same vein, like there would be a option for India to open up a front, as I said, somewhere along the line of actual control to grab some land in Tibet. Now, once a ceasefire is called, this would be used as a bargaining chip to go back to the status quo before the hostilities broke open.
Hmm.
So for this very reason, like a few years ago, India's armies like 17 Corps called as the Mountain Strike Corps, which is based in Panagarh, West Bengal, was raised for an offensive strike into Tibet. So the MSC is being deployed in something which is new to the Indian Army, which is called an integrated battle group. And this concept is being tested in Arunachal Pradesh to practice in mountain warfare, to see how we could operationalize and have at a moment's notice operationalize and put a deep thrust into Tibet if the need arose. So now Nitin Pai, the director of Takshashila Institute, has pointed out this week in an article that as for military activities during official visits, China should be the last to complain. In 1992, Beijing tested a megaton nuclear weapon when then President R. Venkatraman was on the first ever visit by an Indian president to China. In 2007, China conducted its anti-satellite or ASAT test when foreign minister was on an official visit to India. And more recently, in 2014, the PLA carried out incursions in Chumar even as she was swinging with Modi in a Jula in Ahmedabad. Jula, sorry. So if China claims its pattern uh, during high level visits is innocent, so is the Indian exercise Himvijay, end quote. So I think Nitin has very well highlighted that this is nothing new for China to do on their own, but when India does it, probably they get upset a lot, which doesn't make sense.
Agree, agree. In fact, you just brought out the point about the PLA incursion in Chumar and even Demchok sector
Mm-hmm.
when Xi was actually in Ahmedabad. And
Mm-hmm.
Modi was quick to point out to Xi that the PLA was
Yes.
not in sync with you, or you were not in sync with the PLA's
Mm-hmm.
thoughts and actions. And that way, he kind of pointed out that both Xi and Xi's administration are not seeing eye to eye when it comes to the line of actual control and also Indian bilateral ties per se. So I think that was a good point that you brought out, Mohal.
Yeah, so now getting back to the actual summit itself, Kishore, you were in Mamalapuram just a week ago. So can you let us know the nitty-gritties of picking this South Indian port town as a location for this informal summit?
Right, sure. So, not many people would have even heard of this small town, Mamalapuram or Mahabalipuram, outside of South India. Now, the summit was planned and executed in a deliberate way to showcase it as a success, highlighting the millennia old ties between Mamalapuram and China, having a South India specific cuisine for dinner, exchanging thoughtfully manufactured gifts, were all meant to strengthen the case for the summit's success. In addition, it was a conscious decision to not just stay away from Delhi, but also from the other usual North Indian locations like Agra to keep the expectations as low as possible. But beyond the theatrics, what were actually discussed? So now, the Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale addressed the press after the culmination of the talks and indicated that the two dignitaries did not discuss about the state of Jammu and Kashmir at all. The secretary repeated that India continues to view J&K as a domestic issue. Now, everybody was thinking that Xi Jinping would actually raise this point face to face with Modi. and Modi might have to keep repeating the often repeated line that J&K is a domestic issue and we do not encourage any third party intervention in this. But luckily, this time around, China did not even bring up this point at all. Now, actually, the biggest takeaway was not even Jammu and Kashmir. The biggest takeaway for India was the fact that the two countries agreed to set up a high level group on trade, investment, and manufacturing to tackle the ever increasing trade deficit. In fact, Mohal, if you notice, despite these noises being made right from Manmohan Singh government and even Narendra Modi 1.0, that the trade deficit is very, very high and steps need to be taken to correct it. The
Yeah.
trade deficit has only been increasing in the opposite direction
Hmm.
for all these years.
Yeah, I think
And
even during the Narendra Modi's term, I
Mhm.
saw statistics somewhere that it was somewhere around 25 billion when he took office, and it has ballooned to double of that to around 50 billion a few years ago. And I think today, I think it's like 57 or 53 billion. So it
Right,
has doubled under just
one
Prime
term
Minister
of
Modi's
Modi.
term, and I think it's becoming more and more of a concern as the days go by.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, in this regard, it was agreed further that India's Finance Minister Nirmala Sitaraman would discuss modalities with the Chinese counterpart, Hu Chunhua, to come up with measures to bring the deficit down. Bilateral trade, Mohal, you were mentioning this, between China and India actually reached 95 billion in 2018, with the trade deficit being at 53 billion in China's favor. And this, in fact, is the biggest that India has with any country. Now,
And
be that.
also one more thing, I think it's almost like 35% of our overall deficit with all nations combined. If I read it correctly recently.
Phenomenal, phenomenal. No wonder people do keep making noise about it.
Yeah.
Okay, okay. So India, beyond the trade deficit, India also managed to get a nod from China with regards to the RCEP agreement and the need for the free trade agreement to be balanced for it to be more palatable to India. Now, how will it pan out in the days to come, weeks to come, and the years to come? We don't know, but at least India has managed to get the ears of China, and China now understands that India finds some issues with the proposed free trade agreement. It needs to be seen how they tackle this forward. Now, again, we've already mentioned that China didn't raise the issue of Jammu and Kashmir. Now, while it is obvious that China has made enough noise globally harming India's interests by siding with Pakistan, Xi Jinping didn't bring it up for discussion with Modi. One possible reason for this could have been the fact that the Minister for External Affairs, Subramaniam Jaishankar, had recently visited Beijing and had apprised them of India's stand on Jammu and Kashmir. Again, Mohal, I did point it out that during Xi's visit to Ahmedabad in 2014,
Hmm.
there was an incursion from the Chinese troops in Ladakh, and Modi was quick to point out that PLA and Xi Jinping do not always look eye to eye. Now, Indrani Bakchi noted in one of her reports today that Modi continues to see this dichotomy where Xi speaks one language while his administration speaks another. Now, the same template was also played out during Dolam crisis, and the informal summit was proposed to actually address such tricky issues in an informal manner. So that is
Yeah.
how the origins of this
Mhm. But I
informal
think
summit came up.
that also shows the sort of the schizophrenic nature of Chinese diplomacy. So I think if you just look over the past 1 or 2 weeks, I mean, we had sort of diverging statements on the issue of Kashmir from China, where one hand they mentioned like a more pro-India statement, and then when they had visits from Pakistan by Imran Khan, the tune quickly changed, just
Uh,
within the matter of a few days. So
right.
I think this just shows that. they cannot be trusted because they could quickly change a position within a few hours, right?
Totally,
Sure.
totally. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. Okay. So Xi Jinping also did not raise the issue of Huawei being considered for 5G proposals in India. India will have to address this issue sometime in the near future, whenever it would decide on whether to permit the Chinese telecom infrastructure giant to set up 5G networks in the country. Mind you, this decision, whenever taken, has the ability to either alleviate or strain the bilateral ties in the future.
Already they have given threat that if you don't allow Huawei to participate,
Mhm.
there'll be repercussions, or you know, it won't be good for it. So they already threatened us.
And on the other side, the US has already scared all its allies to
Hmm.
claim that Huawei obviously involves in spying activities.
Yeah.
And if and when any of their allies actually allow Huawei to set up 5G
Hmm.
networks, it would amount to a serious compromise in national security. So India will have to handle this delicately and will have to take a call on whether to allow Huawei to come in or not.
But I think we have done it to some sort, and I think we must give the credit of the bureaucracy. And I don't know whether it's by design or not, because as you know, the bureaucracy in India takes forever, a million years to decide on any small matter, and this is a pretty big strategic concern. So
Right.
what I read recently was that I think Airtel and Jio, they have already started trials with Nokia and Ericsson, and I believe even Samsung in the case of Jio. So I guess the by not deciding for or against Huawei, the government has sort of forced the hands of the operators that they can't keep waiting forever to see whether Huawei would be allowed into the participation. So they go on ahead with this Korean and European vendors to do 5G trials. So if we just keep it in limbo, I guess it will just die a natural death. So I don't know whether we can give credit to the bureaucrats, or maybe it's just like we take damn too long to make any decision. But I guess if Huawei is excluded in the long term by not making a decision, I'm all for it.
Hope so, hope so. Yeah.
So sometimes we always give a lot of bad mouthing of the Indian bureaucracy, but this is where slow working Indian bureaucracy might work to our advantage.
Even stuck clock is right twice a day, Mohal.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, okay, moving on. So, at a more generic level, both the leaders agreed to stay away from making damaging statements regarding the other country. And this was an obvious reference to both Hong Kong and Jammu and Kashmir. But we have seen many instances earlier when India held up its end of the bargain by not raising the issue of Tibet or Xinjiang or Taiwan or Hong Kong. But whereas China was more than willing to break its end of the promise, example being Jammu and Kashmir or Arunachal Pradesh, and many such examples. So again, it would not be surprising if China would not live up to its end of the bargain in the future also. Now, to conclude, my take on the whole path from Wuhan Spirit to Chennai Connect has been the manner in which there had been very less traction from April 2018 until now. These are two extremely popular leaders within their two nations, and it is this which aids them to harden their positions on almost all aspects of discussions, be it terrorism, trade deficit, security, border disputes. By virtue of digging their heels, they stand up strong and straight with the sole purpose of projecting powerful versions of themselves. All bonhomie and smiles apart, there is still a long way to go before we term this relationship substantial. For now, both sides continue to parrot the same lines that we agree to not let the differences turn into disputes. Having said that, should we scrap these informal summits also? Of course not. This is the only available avenue now for both the countries to stay engaged. Such engagements help the two nations understand the other's position, what and where are the red lines, and what are the potential areas of cooperation. slowly but surely, the informal summits are actually gaining traction. After all, has invited Modi to China next year for the third edition of the informal summit. The proof of the pudding lies in not how many informal summits do these two leaders have, but in what tangible results do these summits achieve. Mohal,
Yeah,
in conclusion, you have anything to add in terms of
yeah.
takeaway?
So I think taking forward the point that you made,
Mhm.
that we might not have huge massive changes in foreign policy or results from these summits, but it's best to at least keep talking, because
Right,
it keeps the temperatures low, and unlike like what happened during the Dolam standoff, because there is no other alternative to talking. I don't think India or China would want to go to a war to resolve its boundary disputes or in the other domains. Now, uh, I think one word that a lot of the diplomats have used is like how to manage the relations. I think this is more of like how to manage the relations despite the obvious differences on trade and boundary disputes and etc. So what we are trying to see, like both the leaders are trying to see like how they can de- uh, discuss their path forward for their nations, their aspirations, and their future goals, and try to educate the other side about the same, that what is the future for China, what is the future for India, and just so that the other side has a better understanding
hmm
of this whole process, and it is less likely that they would have misconceptions arise, which would lead to the ties being more strained in the future. Now obviously, discussing your aspirations and goals doesn't go anywhere towards resolving our disputes, which will still be require a lot of long hard work to resolve this, but at least it's better than not talking. So I know there are a lot of critics of these summits which say like, why even are they even meeting if nothing major comes out? But
right,
I guess it's better than not talking at all. Only one caveat I have is like the supporters of this informal summit should not go to town like over advertising the benefits gained from this, because obviously there are no major ones, but it's not as if it's a useless summit altogether. So to quote from like what Indrani Bakchi's article on this summit was, and I quote, so the Modi Xi summit cannot be plucked out of the current international context both the countries find themselves in. Xi and his delegation attention this weekend was divided between the summit in Tamil Nadu and Washington DC in US, where China's chief negotiator Liu He met with his US counterparts to achieve a bare bones trade agreement, or as President Trump called it, phase one of the trade deal.
hmm
Now, the deal, whatever it is, eases the pressure on China and the US. It may give Xi the room he wants to wait out the Trump administration and see what the 2020 US presidential elections bring to the White House before attempting a reset. Now, the MEA press statement issued at the end of the summit states that leaders shared the view that the international situation is witnessing significant readjustment. As the US China divide sharpens and it promises to outlive Trump, powers like India will try to do two things: utilize the space to maneuver itself into a pole in what will necessarily be a multipolar world, while trying to balance all sides. This is the ultimate seductive lure of India's foreign policy to its practitioners, which has always delivered suboptimum results but never fails to find adherence within the system. In one of his speeches in Washington, which is now dubbed as the full Jaishankar, India's foreign minister said that the almost simultaneous Japan India US trilateral and the India China Russia trilateral meetings denoted some kind of equivalence. The country that fares the best is the one which has the least problems with his peer group and the broadest acceptance and beyond, he said. China understands well that the implications of India's tilt to the US and the West, even if many Indians don't. This will always color China's actions vis-a-vis India, because they are the practitioners of real politic. India can use the Chinese challenge to step on the gas to reform its economy and unshackle enterprise and agriculture, which will have added advantage of giving it more elbow room as global politics readjust to a new reality. China is India's most important neighbor and its most complex relationship. What we saw in Chennai this weekend was a fantastic display of spectacle symmetry. Modi and Xi go back with a better understanding of each other and their priorities. Their strategic communications has gotten stronger and perhaps deeper. How this will transform the daily politics of two rising powers remain to be seen. End quote. So I think this was a good brief description which I read verbatim from Indrani Bakchi on the summit. So any concluding thoughts, Kishore?
I think you were right in telling that it had to be looked at from a global context. Now, obviously, India and China will have to uh, keep talking to each other despite
Mm-hmm.
how the US-India relationship or the US-China relationship pans out.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, those two bilaterals will also have a bearing on the India-China relationship as well.
Mm-hmm.
So again, US will be the elephant in the room whenever India and China keep talking.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Another
Yeah.
point,
Mm-hmm.
sorry, another point was whether do we have to continue talking with China or not? Yes, the fact
Mm-hmm.
that it helps uh, for India to actually put forth its perspective whenever there are any differences between India and Pakistan. Now, obviously, Pakistan will be the first one to run to Beijing to talk about its perspective
Mm-hmm.
and explain to Beijing about how it feels about any actions committed by India. And by virtue of not talking, India will lose out on that opportunity to explain to Beijing as to what has been its viewpoint and what has been its thought process on doing whatever it thought was wise enough to do. So I think these kind of engagements, these kind of informal summits will allow the two leaders to actually discuss whenever there is a need and also to allow India to explain its perspective. Mohal?
Yeah, I think you brought up a good point on the Kashmir issue. So I think Imran Khan must have made a lot of noise in Beijing when he visited just before Xi's visit.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting that Kashmir, I mean, as per the Indian reports, we don't know like if Chinese side will eventually confirm or will never even confirm that Kashmir was not even brought up. So that brings into perspective that uh, Pakistan might try to make as much noise as possible, but even their sort of iron brother is not willing to discuss that directly in one-on-one, the highest level possible talks with India.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it was not just a report; it was actually Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale himself clarifying in the press briefing. But then,
Hmm.
yeah, I get your point. Point being that
Hmm.
China is not willing to stand up
Yeah.
whenever it is confronted with India.
Hmm. Yeah, I think even China, with its distractions in Hong Kong and the trade deal, sees that it needs to. I think that was the part of the even the why the Wuhan summit was committed, because back then we also had North Korea, and with its
Absolutely
nuclear
correct.
testing, there were just too many uncertainties in the global realm that it just didn't want another situation. Plus, the South China Sea obviously is always a festering issue.
Hmm.
It didn't want the border issue with India to take up most of its time while it deals with all these other regional uncertainties. So it just wanted to sort of not I would say secure its border, but at least make peace somewhere. So they see no harm in talking. The
Mm-hmm.
worry I have is like once China regains its strength and maybe some of these issues in the, let's say, the South China Sea or the trade deal dissipate, will they uh, take a more hawkish stance towards India within? So at least for now there would be like more sort of a peace at the border. I mean, we can have all this what you call the confidence building measures where we have more strategic communication down to the soldier level,
Hmm.
but it doesn't mean that the Chinese will stop incursions into our area, sort of. So I mean, only time will tell how fruitful these summits go going forward. At least it helps maintain some peace and tranquility for India, because in the long run, like the three major dominant players in the world are going to be, like, by the middle of the century will be India, China, and US. So
Hmm.
we have to play this balancing game where we kind of make sure that we have good relations with both, while trying to grow internally to become a bigger power on the world stage.
Totally agree. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess before we wind up this episode, let's switch our focus to the recommendations. So, Kishore, what's your recommendation for this week?
Actually, yeah. Just before we started recording for this podcast, I was looking at that YouTube video put out by Strategic News International, where Nitin Gokhale was actually interviewing former ambassador Gautam Bambawale, former ambassador to China, and he
Mm-hmm.
was actually mentioning about 5 key takeaways from the Chennai Connect.
Yeah.
That was actually a good 15-minute video clipping, which kind of explained what are the key takeaways for India from the informal summit. So I would recommend that to our listeners. And Mohal, your
Yeah,
recommendation?
yeah, that was a good recommendation. I would just recommend Indrani Bakchi's article, from which I quoted like around 4 paragraphs.
Hmm.
I think that's a good takeaway on where the things stand on India-China relations and regarding this summit overall.
Hmm.
So, with that, we come to end of this week's episode, where we covered in, I believe, like Kishore, extensive detail, not only on the informal summit between Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi in China, but also a broad overall picture or overarching picture of India-China relations
Yes.
in and also the summit in Chennai. So now, to continue hearing about such interesting topics, please do subscribe to our channel India Rising, wherever you are listening to us. If you have not left us a review, we urge you to do so, as it helps other listeners like you in finding us. Also, please do share and subscribe this, and so we can get more viewers. We would also like to hear from you if you have any suggestions on any topics that you would like us to cover. Do remember that these topics should be directly related to Indian foreign policy. This is Mohal and Kishore signing off for this week.